This is the new Funco Traxxas sandrail, and I've got big plans for this beast. Let's dig in. First of all, I have to say the pictures do not do this thing justice. It is absolutely beautiful. We've got giant front disc brakes, a full roll cage, driver figures, big seats inside, a complete interior, a bunch of scale licensed detail, and even a really cool looking engine here in the back. This thing comes surprisingly disassembled with the wheels and tires in bags, as well as the antennas and a whole bunch of other stuff. Starting with the wheels and tires, these are unique to the Funco sandrail Traxxas. These things are pretty big. The rears are very wide and they are belted. They feel pretty darn stout. I'm curious to see how these things are going to run on general terrain. Obviously, they're going to do well in the sand, but a lot of people aren't going to be running on sand, so we'll see how these run on a bunch of different terrains. The fronts are actually quite a bit smaller and they aren't belted. As you can see from the 3 screws here, these rings are removable. And taking those 3 screws off lets you take the ring off, which means you can swap these out for whichever rings you want. They're going to be color matched to your car out of the box, but you can just take them off or use different colors. Underneath that, you can see the tires are glued on. These appear to be fairly well glued, and these tires do feel better than a lot of the Traxxas tires I've had in the past. I'll be curious to see if the foams hold up though, because it's those foams that tend to degrade on these tires before the tires themselves fail. Interestingly, it does not appear as though the wheels or tires on this car are vented. I wouldn't expect the tires to be vented on the rear since they're belted, but we don't see any venting here in the wheel or on the tire in the front either. These wheels and tires do use the same 24mm hexes that the X-Max and XRT use. These aren't the standard 24mm hexes that you'll get on every other 1/5 scale size car, as the spindle that goes through the wheel is smaller, and they use standard 17mm size nuts, though the thread on these is different from basically every other 17mm nut as well, so these are pretty unique to Traxxas. As you can see, these hexes are castellated. This means without modification, these won't fit on standard 24mm hexes, though standard 24mm hex wheels will fit on the truck. In the rear, those tires are going to be mounting up to some hexes that look very, very similar to the X-Max and XRT, but in the front, things look very different. But before we dig into the mechanics, let's get this body off and take a closer look at it. This body uses a similar clipless system to the XRT with a latch here in the back, and another one right here under the front. And then the whole thing just lifts right off. Then taking a closer look at this, it is a fully licensed version of a full-sized, very, very expensive sandrail. Funco makes them, and they are really premium. This mini Traxxas version has a full integrated roll cage. You can see the latches in the front and in the rear. And it also has a dedicated light controller for those really cool lighted whip antennas. Installation of those antennas actually requires some disassembly of the car. Traxxas does give you a little hex wrench to get these screws out, but of course, we're gonna use power tools. With those 2 screws out, the top panel lifts right off, and then these antennas are going to mount in these holes with some screws on the sides. But before we do that, let's take a look at this mechanism because it's pretty unique. Obviously, being mounted on top of the car, these are going to be subject to a lot of force, so they've actually created a spring-loaded system. As you can see, there's a couple of wires down there, and those go into springs. So when the top of the car gets hit, they'll get bent backwards, and hopefully they won't break, but I still think these are going to be susceptible to damage. We're definitely going to see how they survive some bashing in just a few minutes. Traxxas does give us a nice little pamphlet to show us how to install those whip antennas, though they do recommend watching the installation video you can get from this QR code. But the install doesn't seem terribly complicated. We're just going to feed these wires down through the holes and then push the antennas down in where they go. Then secure them with the included screws. Then just reinstall the top panel, and finally hook up the wiring. This isn't super complicated, though I can imagine if you don't have power tools, it could be a bit time consuming as there are quite a few screws to install. Getting back to the chassis, from about here to here, this looks pretty similar to the XRT, but back here it looks different, and up here it looks very different. These battery trays look very similar, if not identical, to the ones on the XRT. They're pretty large and pretty deep, and should hold a good variety of different batteries. This ESC is the same VXL 8S unit we've seen for quite a while in the XRT and the X-Max. This uses 6.5mm bullets to go to the motor. The motor wires themselves are pretty short, which kind of limits your options for aftermarket ESCs, though there are a few that will fit without too much modification. Don't worry though, too much modification is going to be the name of the game on this car in the future. Underneath the lid of the patented waterproof case, we do have the TQI receiver. This is the same receiver we've seen a million times before, though it does have a few extra connections. The motor and heatsink are identical to the XRT, but behind it, things really change. And one thing I noticed right off the bat is that we've got some grease poking out here. With all those screws removed, we can take off this 2-piece cover. Make sure you don't miss the one screw hidden down here because it won't come off without it. This cover does feel pretty stout. The rear cover also feels fairly strong. Of course, now we can see where all that grease came from. This is an absolute mess of grease. Underneath that, we get our first look at the rear powertrain. This bevel gear assembly is pretty interesting. It's got the gear on the outside. This is what changes the longitudinal rotation of the motor to transverse rotation for the wheels. These gears are very large, although all of these are going to be sintered steel. That may or may not make you happy, depending on your experience with Traxxas sintered steel gears. Unfortunately, in order to get this out, it looks like the motor's going to have to come out first. You can see that the motor uses the same pin-style adjustment system for mesh that we saw on the X-Max and XRT, and this gear appears to be the same style as on the X-Max and XRT, though it's connected to not a push drive or a slipper clutch. This is a direct drive system, though we are going from steel to plastic to steel here. Hopefully this isn't going to be a weak point. One thing Traxxas finally has seen fit to do is include these motor mount washers out of the box. These help prevent the motor mount slots from getting deformed, and they really should have been on both the X-Max and the XRT. If you don't already have them, I definitely recommend getting them for both of those vehicles, as they're very helpful. Just like with the X-Max and XRT, this splits into 3 different modules, and I think we should go ahead and do that just so we can take a closer look at everything. And with the removal of about 475 screws, the rear module is free. As you can see, there is no center drive shaft because this is only rear-wheel drive. That should actually make this area a bit stronger, hopefully keeping those gears on the other side in better alignment. These springs feel very stiff. We have the normal preload adjustment perch here, but then a second one which holds on this fake reservoir. These reservoirs look pretty convincing, though I'm not usually a huge fan of them. And then under this shock cap, I expect to see the exact same type of bladder style shock as on the XRT and X-Max. And yep, we do have the same bladder here. Hopefully that means we'll be able to do some upgrades to these shocks. Speaking of which, if you want to see me do a bunch of upgrades to this truck, make sure you stay tuned. That video is going to be coming very soon. This cage surrounds the simulated motor and includes the rear body mounts. And then with the removal of those 4 screws, the entire simulated motor comes out. As you can see, this thing is very detailed. It includes headers out to an exhaust, all of the belts, a supercharger, the intakes and air filters, as well as a bunch of really cool details. This does have quite a bit of mass to it, though. And then with that removed, things are finally starting to look familiar back here. Anyone familiar with the XRT or X-Max will be immediately at home once we remove that extended rear skid plate. And then one more screw to remove this brace, and as you can see, these C and D block reinforcements look identical to those on the XRT and the X-Max. These arms, while metal coated, are actually identical to the HD arms on the X-Max, which means a wide kit isn't out of the question here. Because that bevel gear is up higher, the differential just has this giant straight cut gear on it. And just like with everything else on my particular example, it has way too much grease on it. These output cups also appear very similar to the X-Max and XRT, though these are quite a bit bigger than on the X-Max and XRT. Again, probably an upgrade part for those cars. And hiding inside this giant gear, again covered in 15 pounds of grease, is basically the same differential we've seen in the X-Max and XRT. However, this is also filled with grease, which is a huge disappointment. Why doesn't it have differential fluid in it? Anytime somebody wants to tune this with differential fluid, they're gonna have to get all this grease out of here and completely clean it before they can do any tuning. This, on a $1,300 car, is completely inexcusable. That needs to change. That differential is gonna be driving standard X series CVDs with XRT hubs in the rear, and driving that is a big idler gear right here that's just a simple gear with bearings on it, so we're not going to take that apart because it's time to move on to the front where things get really exciting. But before we dig into the front module, I've got one more thing I want to look at. Because there's no front drive, there's not going to be any center drive shaft under this cover, but what is under here? All right, as you can see, this space is filled with the new steering servo and this brake servo, which is going to open up some really cool possibilities for the future. Make sure you stay tuned for that. This new steering servo is the 2085 XL. I don't think this is quite as good as the 2085R, but it should be a huge step up from the plastic geared servos we got in the X-Max and the XRT. And then the brake servo is just a standard generic Traxxas unit. And speaking of the brake servo, now it's time to take a look at the real party piece on this truck. On the front, Traxxas is nice enough to give us little arrows marking where all the screws are we need to remove to get that front module off. Though it does seem like we're going to have to take this adjustment knob off the front brake system in order to decouple everything and actually remove it. There we go. Then as you can see with that off, we have a normal looking servo horn here that goes to this long rod. Then that rod goes through here with this spring and nut for adjustment. When it gets pulled back, it pulls these two cables back, and each one of those cables goes to one of these front brake calipers. Pulling this caliper off, you can see there are brake pads inside here, hopefully with no asbestos in them, and a lever here that's pulled by that cable, which pushes a little button in there, which pushes the brake pads together against this big, giant, beefy steel rotor. That rotor works on this extended hex, and that's attached to these similar but unique front hubs that have the mount for the caliper on them. This whole front hub and knuckle assembly is unique. You can see the kingpin running all the way through there, and then hiding in here is the front spindle, which again looks very similar to the four-wheel drive XRT and X-Max, but just doesn't have any of the bits inside for the axle itself. Those are connected to arms that are also unique to this car, and then in the middle there's not really much going on because again this isn't driven. These shocks are very similar to the rear, they're just a lot shorter, though something I just realized that you guys might have already known is these are the GT Max shocks, not the GTX Max shocks. These are actually the shocks off the Max, not the X-Max and XRT. Very, very similar in design, but they're quite a bit smaller. I'm surprised to see those on here, and now I'm really curious to see how they're going to hold up long term. These steering links are straight off the X-Max and XRT, and it appears as though most of the rest of the steering system is also right off the XRT. And I think that covers everything that's new on this brand new Traxxas. Now let me get all this put back together and let's go see how much fun this Funco is. The last thing we need to do before we go out is see exactly how these brakes are being controlled. There's not a brake channel on the receiver. There is, however, a second steering channel on here, and I suspect that's been repurposed for the brakes. However, controlling these brakes isn't going to be the simplest thing in the world. Let's see how they're doing it. Okay, we get a little reset when it first turns on. Now, if I hit the throttle, we get nothing, but if I hit the throttle and then the brakes, you can see it puts the front brakes on fully until I release them. Once I've released them, though, if I hit reverse, it goes in reverse with no brakes, but then once I hit reverse and hit the brakes again, it applies the brakes. So we're going to get brakes in forward and reverse, but it's smart enough not to apply the brakes when we go into reverse once it's already sitting still. So again, if we go forward and hit the brakes, it puts the brakes on. And if we go forward again, it takes the brakes back off again. Pretty straightforward. All right, guys, I'm gonna get these batteries charged up, get the tires and body put on this thing, and let's take it for a blast. Now, ostensibly, this thing's designed to be used in sand dunes, but I would say maybe 10% of us have access to sand dunes. So let's see how this thing does on a bunch of different surfaces, including a top speed run on grass. See if we can get full throttle, full throttle. Haha, she screams. Those brakes seem to work pretty well. Full throttle. Yeah, it feels pretty good. This thing is definitely gonna be fun. I can tell already. Let's see what we got there. Full throttle. Nice. All right, let's bring it in. And we got 47 miles an hour. That's pretty good for off-road with this thing that's not designed to run on grass. Let's see what else it can do. One thing I was definitely curious about is how stable it's gonna be on concrete. And yeah, it seems to work okay on concrete. Definitely makes some noise. Those front brakes aren't locking up quite as much as I'd like to see them lock up on concrete, though it's gonna behave differently on different surfaces. And yeah, this thing is definitely runnable on concrete. Does she run in a big open grass field? Well, as you can see, obviously, we're gonna be kicking up some serious rooster tails with this thing. And honestly, for being rear wheel drive, with having that TSM and those disc brakes, it really doesn't feel like a rear wheel drive vehicle. It tends to push straight under acceleration, which makes sense as we don't have those front wheels being driven, and they're pretty smooth, so we're not gonna get great traction with them. But overall, this thing kind of doesn't feel like a two-wheel drive vehicle. I think how large and heavy it is has a lot to do with that. Let's check the brakes. And yeah, I think those front brakes could use a little bit of adjustment, but overall, if your terrain is grass, I don't think you'll have any problem with this thing right out of the box. It's definitely fun. But what about gravel with some nice tasty hills? Yeah, she's definitely tearing up the gravel as well, kicking up some serious dust, serious rooster tails, big jump. Landed pretty much right on the roof and the antennas are fine. Ow! Gotta be careful not to get hit in the face with the rooster tail. This thing absolutely screams. Let's see if we can jump this. A little bit of a jump. Let's see if we can do better. So far, this thing feels like a pretty fun basher, especially for a two-wheel drive vehicle. Like I said, that mass really does help keep it stable. And overall, other than getting gravel in your face, if gravel's the surface you have to run on, you're gonna be happy with this as well, because it's pretty fun on gravel. Man, I forgot we haven't even seen if it'll do a wheelie yet. Will it do a wheelie? Oh yeah, she'll do a wheelie. Big time wheelie. I didn't put the wheelie bar on, I usually don't. But it's actually pretty easy to carry a wheelie even without that wheelie bar on. This thing is an absolute monster. I have to say, this is probably the most fun two-wheel drive vehicle I've ever driven, and it's really impressing me so far. But this thing was built for the sand, so how does it handle the sand? Oh yeah, she likes the sand. That was a good jump. Pushing up some big rooster tails, getting great traction with these paddles. In the sand, it's getting so much traction that it is kind of difficult to steer on throttle. That's not really unusual and to be expected, so there is going to be a little bit more skill involved with driving this than something like a regular 1/8 scale four-wheel drive basher, because if you go full throttle and turn full at the same time, it's just gonna go straight. But this thing is an absolute weapon. It is so much fun. Wow, that's cool. This thing is way better than I thought it was gonna be. See how it handles some rough terrain? Yeah, not bad. I mean, again, it's a two-wheel drive vehicle, so it's gonna have some limitations, but within those limitations, this thing is really eating it up. Get a shot of those rooster tails. Woohoo! That gearing makes it sound absolutely menacing, too. It sounds so mean under acceleration. Yeah, guys, Traxxas has a winner on their hands with this one, but the real question is, can it actually jump? To find out, we're gonna use this ramp that's entirely too small for it, but should work anyway. Nice slow jump at first. Yeah, not bad. It does land pretty hard though, and of course air control is gonna be a problem with a two-wheel drive vehicle, so how you leave the jump is very important. Oh, we have our first breakage. A fake shock reservoir snapped right off. Yeah, okay, it does jump, but it doesn't really feel super happy about it. It lands really heavy in the back, and I'm afraid to make it land with a nose-down attitude because I really don't want to break it. Yeah, it just doesn't really like to jump that much. That's not really what this thing's designed for. Overall, though, for what it is designed for, it is an absolute monster. This thing feels like nothing else I've ever driven, and it is a ton of fun. All right, guys, so the Traxxas Funco Sandrail Pro Sandcar 1/5 scale X-Max XRT two-wheel drive thing, what do I think about it? The body itself came away relatively unscathed. There are a few scratches and marks on it, but overall nothing too serious. I did notice that one of my floppy antennas is a little more floppy than it was before, and I suspect these wires and or these mounts are not going to survive serious bashing for very long. If you're gonna be doing any serious bashing with this thing, I'd recommend just taking them off. Underneath, other than being really dusty, the chassis itself held up really well. We did break off one of the fake reservoirs back here and promptly lost it, but that's not really a functional part. Even on stock gearing, this powertrain has plenty of power for it. I was particularly impressed with these paddle tires. For being paddle tires, they were really versatile and worked on pretty much every terrain. For just general hooning around and tearing things up, this thing handles really, really well. I was very impressed with the two-wheel drive system. The TSM makes it drive very easily, and all the mass of it being as large as it is makes a big difference compared to smaller vehicles. The front brakes also worked really well. They do need to be adjusted a little bit for my particular terrain, but they did work. The one thing I really wasn't happy with was how it jumped, and that's not really a huge surprise. This thing really isn't made to be jumped. It did do it successfully, but it was kind of rough on landing. And I do wonder how much these 4S Max spec shocks are to blame. These things are pretty small, and I'm not sure they're up to the task of handling this kind of mass hitting the ground that hard. Overall, I would say my opinion on this car is surprised. There were some good surprises and some bad surprises. I was really not happy to see grease in the rear differential, though the gearing and everything back here seems very, very beefy. I was surprised at how friendly the handling was for being a really high power two-wheel drive vehicle. I was surprised at how fun it was. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of surprised at my opinion on it that it might actually be worth $1,300. Will this be worth $1,300 to everybody? Absolutely not. But this does feel like a return to form for Traxxas. This is an innovative product. They've taken a chance. They've made something really cool that's different from everything else out there. And I think it's a really cool product, and it's a fantastic, fun, unique driving experience. If you're on the fence about this thing and you don't mind spending the money, I'd say go ahead and pick one up. It's a lot of fun. If you're on the fence about subscribing to this channel, don't be, because we've got some crazy plans for this thing and you're not going to want to miss them. And you're not going to want to miss watching one of these videos.